Alright, guys and gals, what is up? Let's jump into war and U.S. foreign policy on war. So, just to rehash last week, we talked about interest groups, what they are, different types, and their place in wider theory and how they affect policy. So, what are they? On average, they want two things, or they want one thing and don't want the other thing to be possible. And it's to influence policy, but they did not want to hold office themselves. And for the second class, we talked about collective action, the role of PACs and super PACs, different advocacy campaigns, how they will target politicians sometimes, and other times they target voters, and lobbying. Parts of this were who they influence. So, like I just talked about, do they target politicians or voters? How they influence. So, are they funding a campaign? Are they donating directly to candidates? Are they donating to party infrastructure? In what ways is it legal? In what ways is it illegal? Where are the gray areas like red boxing? And how that fits into policymaking? Well, interest groups have a vested interest in influencing policy. So, with the lesson on war, we will be talking about modern war, causes, effects, and the war trap. Now, I can only talk as someone who has never served in the military. I've studied this for quite a while. I went to the Citadel for undergrad, so I feel like I know more than most people. But if we want to talk about the realities of war, you're going to have to ask someone who's actually experienced it themselves. I think I mentioned once I had an AK-47 drawn on me when I was in Cambodia, but that was just a robbery. So anyone who has even been in the military knows infinitely more than I do about the reality of war, but we can talk about the theory still. I mean, I'm lucky enough to have my only real exposure to the horrors of war be seeing that one scene in Star Wars 6 where the teddy bear guy is trying to wake up his friend. So, the reality of war, don't listen to me. But, like I said, we can talk about the theory. Now, anyone who hasn't been to war and hasn't spoken to anyone who has been to war, um, well, no, I won't say anyone, but a lot of people will treat it like it's almost an initiation ritual into adulthood, right? Um, Sort of the first stage of people's relationship with it. It's this very almost like Disney or Marvel, which I guess is technically Disney, um, idea that you're going to go into war, maybe lose a friend, but in like a very cool, dramatic way. And then with all your other friends, you're going to get victory, have champagne in the enemy base, celebrating their defeat, and then go home and sort of ride that high. If it seems very Disney, I expect enough. Well, let's say I expect enough of you to know or to believe that y'all know this isn't the case. Um, and even the book and later movie that was written about challenging that idea, All Quiet on the Western Front, is where this image is from, where the main character, I believe his name is Paul, which cool points for being named Paul, by the way, is very excited to be going to war. From what I've been told, the reality is not Jon Snow fighting off whatever. I stopped watching Game of Thrones at that point. Um, but it is more weapons made to maim, not even kill. So instead of a glorious death, a lot of the time it is hospital beds and catheter bags. Um, Very bleak stuff. But yeah, the first book that really challenged what war is does not come from political science. It comes from German literature. So Heinrich Maria Remarque will All Quiet on the Western Front. I'm not even going to try to pronounce the name in German. Made into several movies. I believe the most recent one was in like 2022, 2023. I haven't seen it, but I adore the book. And when I say German in the 1900s, a lot of people automatically assume the bad type of German. Um, just call it a Nazi. People assume it was a Nazi, but this book is actually about World War One, and Heinrich Maria Remarque was actually kicked out of Germany for writing this book. Well, not explicitly for writing the book, is he was accused of being secretly Jewish because of, and this is how just insane the Nazis were, and like unfathomable levels of anti-Semitic. Um, but if you replace the QUE with a K, so you pronounce it the same, Remarque, and then spell it backwards, it makes Kramer, which is a traditionally Jewish name. So that was the actual pretext of running him out of Germany. Of course, the reality was is that the Nazis really didn't like him. I prefer to talk about World War One than World War Two, not just because I'm such a big fan of the book All Quiet on the Western Front, but because I think World War Two is just such an anomaly. Here's a meme about World War One. But World War Two is such an anomaly with clear good guys and villains, whereas World War One, Vietnam, most wars throughout history are not nearly as clean cut as fighting literal Nazis. So I think World War One or Vietnam are the more accessible ones. So those are going to be our two main touchstones for this. And we'll see how history rhymes, like with Iraq or with what's suspected to go on in Iran. I don't know if y'all saw, but there was leaked audio from the current administration that said, where Trump himself was saying that the Iran war conflict, whatever we're going to call it, he thought it would be over in 3 days. So Home by Christmas really ironically struck home. But like we talked about with the example of World War One and just the absolute cluster that led to Americans going off to die for the territorial integrity of Serbia. I mean, I think it's way more indicative of just how much of a mess war is and how so much of it's really controlled by elites. I would never denigrate a soldier from the U.S. Army for serving ever, but there is a lot of criticism that can be given for leadership like that, and that allows American servicemen to go die, servicemen and women, later on. So going into what war looks like now, it can still be morally gray, but as you can see in this chart, the actual number of battle deaths has plummeted. Now, comparing it to World War II isn't the most charitable way to start this graph, because World War II is one of the biggest single events that caused human death. The other, I forget the ranking, but the other big two are the Taiping Rebellion, which I'm sure a lot of you are like, what the hell is the Taiping Rebellion? And the Great Chinese Famine, which also I'm sure a lot of y'all are thinking, what the hell was the Great Chinese Famine? But within especially a Western-centric case, there's no bigger cause of death than World War II and the events around it. So as you can see, as time or the decades go on, with the Cold War and all the proxy wars around it, especially once we hit the 2000s, battle deaths plummet. But then here's the weird thing, is that while battle deaths are going down, the actual numbers of wars go up. So, or at least remain constant. You can see at the end, especially after the 80s, there's a big spike in the amount of wars going on. So I mean, if you're anything like me, you're thinking, well, what the Sam heck is that about? Well, that's mainly because war has gotten a lot smaller. So instead of like events like World War One, like if you look at 1918 on this graph, when World War One ended, it's immediately followed by this big spike. But World War One is these big empires going to war against each other, where now what war looks like is a lot of small localized conflicts. For example, would anyone believe me if I said Armenia and Azerbaijan have been at war for the last couple of years? Probably, because most of us can't point to that on a map. Where when both of those were belonging to the Ottoman Empire, it was a different case. So I don't have kids yet, but those of you who do, or those of you who know people who do, can tell you kids quite often will ask very mature questions, just sort of out of the blue. So I remember watching some movie that I was way too young for, and then asking my mom, "What are the causes of war?" And well, she said, "Oh, according to the current poli-sci literature, there are one of three things needs to happen, and then a fourth thing needs to happen. So one of the three things either needs to be greed, grievance, or opportunity." And she said to me, "We can talk about the fourth thing that needs to happen later." If you can't tell, I'm joking. This is just what the literature says. Whatever my mom said in reality didn't stick with me because I was, like I said, way too young. So, greed as a cause of war isn't as common as you would think it is. So, being the primary driver of war is what we're talking about. How does this help the leadership get one step closer to a mansion in a nice area, or at least a second, third, or fourth mansion if they already have one? So, when we talk about wars that start, or at least caused by greed, we'll take a second to think of one. Keep in mind, these are wars have to do with the winner ending up with more money. Not power, not influence, just money that can be measured in one's bank account, or at least stock portfolio. Whatever you said, I'm going to assume it's correct because you guys are awesome. But the war that I'm sure we were all thinking of was the Sierra Leone Civil War in the 90s. If you've ever heard the term blood diamond, that's where this comes from. Um, But what it ultimately was a group pretending to fight for revolution, individual rights, called the RUF, went to war with the government over the ability to get diamonds to then sell to other people in other countries. If you want to learn more about this, which I'm sure you're very eager to, I strongly recommend this article, Diamonds, a Rebel and a Farmer's Best Friend. So play off the old saying that diamonds are a girl's best friend. Um, but what Anouk Rigterink, I'm assuming is how you pronounce her name. It's either Dutch or German, a language I'm not familiar with. Um, was actually able to show strong evidence that as diamond prices went down, the RUF would go fight the government, but when diamond prices were up, the RUF would focus on diamond mining because it was making more money. So the worth or what people are willing to pay for diamonds was directly influencing the Sierra Leone Civil War. Fascinating piece of scholarship. Massive respect to the woman who wrote this, even though I can't pronounce her name. And I strongly recommend this article, especially if you're considering grad school. So if greed is somehow the most and least obvious one, grievance is another big one that comes up. So when we talk about grievance, we talk about these long-standing issues that have been going on forever, which as opposed to the long-standing issues that don't go on forever. Um, but not all of these will turn into wars, right? World War One ended so disproportionately not in favor of the Germans that it built a lot of grievance within the Weimar Republic or interwar Germany that they ended up blaming people who had nothing to do with it because it was convenient, so mainly the Jews. But it was a mix of that and grievances that so much of historic German territory was taken away that it was able to fuel what would eventually lead to the Nazi invasion of Poland, kicking off or sort of being what everyone, or not everyone, but most people say is the starting point of World War II. So, can you think of any other grievance based wars? I'll give you a second. So, these are any wars that are based on revenge. Whatever, like with the greed question, whatever you said, I'm going to assume is correct because you guys are awesome. But one that comes to mind is Israel and its conflict with Hamas. Um, but what we can see is actually grievance on both sides, right? So Israel is grieved by the terrorist attacks and slaughter of civilians on October 7th, whereas Hamas, Palestine, some might call it, is aggrieved by longstanding abuses or perceived longstanding abuses from Israel. Trying to dance around this as much as I can because I'm really not trying to offend either side. Uh, but what I think we can say is that regardless of how you feel about who's right, both sides are motivated by grievance. Okay, so finally let's talk opportunity, or using someone else's issues to make a play for power. Um, think about any wars that were possibly based off opportunity. Correct. Whatever you said. Correct. We've talked about this before, but the rise of warlords in Somalia, caused by famines and then UN shipments of food to help the famine, are an example, I would argue, of wars caused by opportunity. So, for those who don't remember, Somalia had a famine. UN sent a bunch of food in, but it was immediately seized by warlords who used that opportunity, having food in an area that had a famine, to gain power over what was essentially an anarchic system. And that's what led to the Black Hawk Down crisis, that ended up being a really good book and a pretty good movie. As for the fourth thing that needs to happen, or maybe not happen, depending on how you look at it, comes to these boxers. Um, I want you to imagine you are one of these two boxers. It really doesn't matter which. But have you found one to internalize, to relate to? Okay. You probably think you are going to win if you're one of these two guys. Doesn't matter which, because they both think they're going to win. What is this? What does this have to do with war? Is that nobody goes to war unless they think they're going to win. The sad truth is, well, let's say unless they think they're most likely to win. But the truth is that if these two boxers fight in the Matrix and you can just reset and have them fight again, one of them is going to win more than 50% of the time. If you think your odds of winning are not good, you are not going to fight. So both of them think they have a greater than 50% chance of winning, but only one of them is correct. And they're not stupid or dumb or ignorant or any of that. It's they have something called a lack of information. And In political science and policy processes, we call it the information problem, or this idea that one of them is misinformed about their ability to win. So I don't know who won this fight. I don't know if it's a real fight even, or just some sort of like Shutterstock thing or whatever. Point being is that one of these two gentlemen is likely to win more than 50% of the time. So one of them has an information problem. And if he was informed he has a less than 50% chance of winning, he's probably not going to fight. Now, I'm sure boxers would take issue with this, but boxing is not war. But the same logic applies to war. All sides of a war think they are the stronger one. One is wrong. One is less likely to win, even if they don't want to admit it. So we don't say they're stupid, we say they lack information. A great example of this in real life is the Boshin War. So I'm sure I don't have to tell you because you all know. This was in 1868 to 1869 in Japan. And what it ultimately was this import of European, if not forces, war tactics to support Imperial Japan against the rebellion of the samurai class. So the samurai class are similar to knights in Western Europe, raised to be warriors. And that's their station in life. It's how they perceive themselves. So they have this idea that they are the ultimate warriors. And I'm sure a lot of dorky white guys who look like me would agree that samurai are the ultimate warriors. The issue is that swords and bows and arrows are not really comparable to black powder. So as Japan was modernizing, the samurai were being phased out. And that led to this rebellion against the emperor. And it's not really against the emperor as much as it is against the emperor's accepting of Western society. They just didn't want to be brought into the rest of the world. And believe it or not, these people who had grown up to think they were the ultimate warriors got absolutely stomped in the Boshin War. I mean, it was very, very, very one-sided because it was literal samurai versus Gatling guns. And I mean, literally. So the samurai weren't stupid. They weren't reasoning unwell. They just lacked information. They didn't know how effective black powder was. And that's why we see this incredibly one-sided war playing out in Japan during the 1860s. Now, this unequal access to information or lack of access to information is what Bruce Bueno de Mesquita calls the war trap. So you're trapped into war if you don't know everything, but you don't know if you know everything or not because you don't know. A great example of this is some would say mythology, others would say fact behind David and Goliath. For those who don't know, in ancient times, wars were sometimes decided by a 1v1 fight to prevent bloodshed. So both sides put forward their champion in this case. Goliath, who, I mean, it's sort of where the name or the connotation for the word big comes from, because Goliath is such a big, powerful soldier, versus David, who had a rock and a sling. Now, what this fight was, when we look at it in terms of the war trap, was a guy who had every reason to believe he could fight tiny little David, who just had a rock and a sling. The thing is in Goliath's mind, he's right. He can easily win against David. I don't know if it's part of the mythology or what, but in David's mind, he believes he can win, or there's some greater purpose in this. But um, both of them have very real reasons to believe they can win. David believes he has God at his side. Goliath believes that this tiny little guy can't possibly beat him. Of course, only one is correct, and only one of them is going to win 50% or more than 50% of the time. Now, speaking of the Middle East, let's go back to talking about what modern war looks like. A lot of it is very grievance based, especially around ethnicity, and especially in the Middle East. So in this chart, you can see all the major ethnic groups in the Middle East. So if the screen is too small because you're watching this on your phone or something, yellow is Arabs, pink is Armenians and Jews, green is the Turks, the dark red is the Kurds, and orange is the Persians. Now, for the most part, we can see that they're all naturally clustered around each other, and you'd expect that because ethnic groups are likely to marry people within the same ethnic group and have children in the ethnic group, and the cycle continues. But where the Middle East becomes particularly an issue is when we look at how these nations align with states, or how these groups of people align with these black lines that are national borders. Now, it's not a coincidence that they are designed like this. What happened was the Ottoman Empire, who controlled most of this, fought on the losing side of World War I. And as part of their concessions, like with Nazi Germany, they were heavily punished. In this case, it was broken up into several different countries, which becomes all these different states in the Middle East, but they didn't get to draw their own borders. So if you look at Jordan, we see this big line just sort of extending into desert for no discernible reason. That area is kind of known as Churchill's sneeze, because the joke was that while he was drawing a line, Winston Churchill sneezed and accidentally gave Jordan this big section of basically worthless desert. So there's this nation-state disalignment within a lot of the Middle East that causes a lot of these wars. So like we talked about with this heavy dark red Kurdish population, so like a lot of them are in Turkey, there's a sizable amount in Iraq, Syria, Iran. Kurds are completely fragmented, but they have enough people to really count as their own state if they were to have the ability to draw their own borders. So you hear about this hypothetical Kurdistan. And that's what they're talking about, is this country that doesn't exist, but as especially the Kurds would argue, should. And this is what I'm talking about when I say Churchill sneeze. This big stretch of desert on the right here that just sort of goes off into territory that, especially to the Europeans, might as well belong to anybody. But in this case belongs to Jordan. Except it's not actually that simple, because this big expansion into desert allows Jordan to share a border with Iraq. So what's interesting is while this was being drawn, so Ottoman Empire falls, Europeans are drawing the borders for the Middle East. So here are the state borders that are completely ignoring nationality or who would actually be good together while the country's recovering. You have the main city in Iraq producing oil, which is Mosul. Now, as part of the agreement for rebelling against the Ottomans, so rebelling against Turkey, Saudi Arabia, to the south, which you really can't see here, but the big orange one, gets to be its own country. So it's complete monarchy, even today, under the House of Saud. So the Arabs under the House of Saud, Saudi Arabia, they are not as reliable as European powers to keep oil coming from Mosul. So that's why this big section of land is given to Jordan. Why is that? Because the oil needs to come out of Mosul and into the Mediterranean Sea so it can be shipped to Europe. And I assume that's the shipping line they used. I have no idea. Now, believe it or not, the oil market and the best places to ship out oil have changed over the last 100 years. So these shipping routes are not optimal anymore. The thing is that the state borders that helped optimize these shipping routes still exist. So because this was such an optimal thing in 1918 and 1919, all these different ethnic groups are stuck with it even today. So moving on to the effects of war. I want you to imagine you are part of the Canadian military. Um, this is a very ripe area to make jokes about Canadians, but I don't have any just sort of ready to go. But like in the War of 1812, Canadians come down south to the United States, burn down the White House, and are barely defeated. But ultimately lose, but cause a massive amount of destruction in the United States. So, like I said, imagine you're a Canadian soldier in this context. Now, all of that happened. Canada, by way of the British, invaded and burned down the White House. But what didn't happen, the opportunity and infrastructure really wasn't there. But what we never saw after that was the Canadian military creating a bunch of books or dramas or anything about how traumatizing it was for them, how traumatizing it was for Canada to go have to burn down the White House and invade a ton of America, or the United States, we'll say. And if they burnt your house on the way to burning the White House and you were from the United States, you'd probably think, well, who gives a shit about how the Canadians feel about my house burning down? They're the ones that did it. Now, pretend I'm not actually talking about Canada invading the United States, but the United States invading a different country and burning a bunch of their places to the ground. So, like with All Quiet on the Western Front and sort of what World War I was, we're talking about people who are caught up in forces beyond their control, but creating these long-standing grievances. Now, Canada never made a bunch of movies or books about how upset they were about having to burn the United States, but the United States has burnt a bunch of movies about how it affected the soldiers personally, how tough it was for them to burn down Vietnamese villages, which is where it gets kind of weird. So to reroute that into a larger talk about what modern war is the Cold War, or sort of the context that the Vietnam War existed within. And so within this, we have the end of World War II and the Soviet Union acquiring nuclear weapons. So both sides of this have nuclear weapons and don't want to risk nuclear war because of MAD, or mutually assured destruction. And the idea that one side launches nukes, every side will launch nukes and destroy the entire world. So to compete for influence without directly risking nuclear aggression, what both major powers, the United States and the USSR, decided to do is to offshore war to the developing world. And that's the real excuse for the Vietnam War or the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan or the issues in Angola or Latin America, is it's trying to avoid nuclear war while still bargaining these disputes, while still having the two boxers fight. And then to a certain level, you have some spy games between the nuclear powers, like Rick Ames, the CIA mole for the Soviet Union. But when it's two states hashing out their disputes, not directly but indirectly through another state, it's called a proxy war. So the Soviet Union was directly involved in the invasion of Afghanistan, but the United States was not. They helped arm the Mujahideen who fought the Soviet Union, which makes it less of a proxy war, but some would argue that that counts. Or the Soviet Union arming the North Vietnamese during the Vietnam War. You could say that's a proxy war, you could say that's not. I think actually a great modern example is the Syrian civil war. So you have pro and anti-Assad forces in Syria fighting each other. One side is armed by the United States, the other side's armed not by the Soviet Union, but by Russia. But there are no Russian troops on the ground, there are no United States troops on the ground. So that's a proxy war. So that's what we say when we have an armed conflict where one or more factions are supported heavily by a third party patron state. The United States is not going to go to war with Russia over Syria, possibly over nothing. Would the United States actually go to war with Russia? But we know for a fact they're not going to go to war with Russia over Syria. So they're going to do this proxy war where they don't have to go to war with Russia, but they can get people to fight Russia for them. And Russia can get people to fight, if not the United States, at least United States influence for them. So with conflicts like Vietnam, we can see US troops on the ground, but there's no Soviet troops on the ground. So you could say it's less than a proxy war or more than a regular war, but it's mainly against the Soviet Union, not the Vietnamese. And you could say similar things about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So there's Soviet boots on the ground and helicopters in the air, but there's no US military soldiers on the ground. So in some definitions, this is a proxy war also. Now, when you look at like long-term rivals to the United States, and you look at the ones that the United States is actually willing to directly invade, as opposed to having a proxy war, well, it speaks to the strength of nuclear weapons. North Korea was under constant threat of invasion, and it still sort of is, but it has a lot more security because it has nuclear weapons now. A big justification for invading Iran over the last couple weeks has been Iran being very close, allegedly, to developing nuclear weapons, which can't be allowed, so there needs to be a war now to avoid an endless series of proxy wars later, is the policy logic behind this. And this isn't unique to Iran. Another state that was accused of being either having or being close to developing nuclear weapons So that's why the United States needed to invade them, quote unquote, now was Iraq. And the WMD scandal around that, or weapons of mass destruction. Now, Iraq had already demonstrated having weapons of mass destruction, just not nuclear, but with chemical through their gassing of the Kurds. So that's where it gets to be very foggy, and you end up really just confirming your own biases the more you talk about it, especially when it's a one-sided talk like this, so we'll leave it there. Now, with all these proxy wars being diffuse all over the world, it's tougher to keep track on them all because there's more wars to follow. You're not going to be able to focus as much. And because of this lack of oversight, we see an increase in war crimes. So that's forced recruitment, attacking civilians, looting, destruction of cultural monuments, rewriting or at least attempting to rewrite history, rape as a weapon of war, and banned weapons. So forced recruitment, going back to the RUF in Sierra Leone, whenever they would take over a village, they gave all the military-age men an option. And when I say military-age men, I'm not being totally honest, or I'm not being broad enough to reflect reality because we're also talking about children who are maybe 10 years old even to bring them out as child soldiers. So let's say you're an 11-year-old boy in Sierra Leone. Your village is taken over. A lot of your friends and family are massacred. And the people who did it bring you forward, like this guy here, and they give you an option. They can't force you, directly at least, to become part of their military, so they're going to give you a choice. You either join their military or you lose an arm, so you can't join the government side. The government would do this too, by the way. But at that point, you might not feel like you have a choice at all. But that's how they would end up recruiting a lot of people for the RUF, is starting to cut off their arms. Like, you can cut off an arm, go back to being a farmer, a one-armed farmer, but we're going to make sure you are not an asset to the other side. So it's forced recruitment, which is a war crime. Furthermore, there's attacking civilians, which I think gathers a lot of media attention and bad press because you're literally attacking innocent people. But one of the reasons this is so common is because either the government can claim it was a mistake, they accidentally attacked the civilians, or they can claim they didn't have intent. The government who ordered the military into the area didn't attack the civilians, but the local level officers did. And with the current international law, it is incumbent on the government to prosecute their own war criminals. If they're not able to, then international court will step in. It doesn't have to be as direct as threatening to cut someone's arm off, but it can be join the military or your family doesn't get fed. Well, it's not really a choice to a lot of people. Where this starts to get very blurry, though, is join or go to jail, which is the system that the United States has and most of the world has through the draft. So how this is navigated is very difficult. And then I don't want to show images of a lot of this stuff, but they all fall under the umbrella of erasing someone's heritage. So that can be either genetically by using rape as a weapon of war, which most notably was a case of the Japanese occupation of South Korea. Attempts to rewrite history, which was a case in Cambodia. Well, in most cases, but most obvious in Cambodia, where they, Khmer Rouge, the communist forces there, literally tried to reset to what was called Year Zero. And finally, and most presentably on a sideshow, is destruction of cultural monuments. So, for those who don't know, Buddhism started in India. Buddha, or Siddhartha Gautama, was actually born in Nepal, but it became a big source as it went east to especially China, Southeast Asia, and Japan, which Japan is where Zen Buddhism comes from. But what a lot of people don't realize is that Buddhism also spread west into the Middle East and sort of hit a geographic limit in Afghanistan. Now, if you know anything about Buddhism, you know that Buddhists are similar to other religions where they like to have images, icons, representations of who they would call Buddha or Siddhartha Gautama all over the place. So what ended up happening is Afghanistan, Buddhism spreads, and Buddhists were able to carve these gigantic statues of Buddha into these cliff faces. Very akin to Mount Rushmore, but just for one person and or God, depending on how you look at it. And to the left, you can see these humans there for scale to get an idea of how big this image of Buddha was. You might have just caught up on the fact that I said was, by the way. What ended up happening is that another religion popular in the area, Islam, famously does not allow for, or some interpretations, I won't say all Muslims believe in this, or even a majority, but the people in control here, because of their Islamic beliefs, believe that there should be no images of gods, so their own god or other gods. Seeing as Buddha is considered a god, they ended up blowing up these national monuments or these cultural heritage sites. In a weird way, it makes sense. These same people, not Muslims, but radical Islamists or political Muslims, radical political Muslims, also a lot of them don't believe in wearing Nike clothes. I'm gonna let that sit in for a second. Why would a lot of radical Islamists who don't believe images of any god, including their own, should exist? Why would they be opposed to Nike? Well, Nike is the ancient Greek god of victory. So it's seen as worshipping not only a false god, but an icon. But anyway, destroying these cultural monuments was a big deal when it happened. People don't really talk about it as much or at all anymore. But this is still considered a war crime and an effect of war. And of course, to a lesser extent, lesser than destruction, but stealing cultural items is also seen by many to be a war crime. I don't know if it is still seen the same in international law, but a lot of people widely consider stealing cultural monuments to be, if not a war crime, at least incredibly illegal under international law. There's an old joke is, do you know why the pyramids are in Egypt? Gonna let that sit for a second. It's because the British couldn't take them back to the British Museum. Famously, the British Museum has all these different wings dedicated to different cultures. So there's and not just the British Museum, but I would say it has the most impressive collection, or worst collection, depending on how you look at it. But there's an Egypt wing, there's an East Asia wing, and all these different things. So with as globalized as Europe is now, you have this weird case where I assume to be Arab gentleman, I assume him to be Arab, I don't know, going to the British Museum, so going all the way to the UK to see his own cultural monuments. I went there 2 or 3 years ago with my wife, who I think I've mentioned she's not American. So when we went to the wing full of her cultural monuments and stuff, um, I was happy to see the monuments, and she was asking why the monuments were not in her country, uh, which it can go both ways, I think. So with war, we have talked about modern war, the causes, effects, and the war trap. Now, I would not be pushing the war trap at the last so much unless it were to be relevant for finals. So please keep that in mind. Anyway, at this point, you know the deal. Questions or comments, hit me up. If you just want to say hi, hit me up. Do whatever you like. For the celebrations that you may or not be celebrating this weekend, I hope you have a good weekend. Or you're all UT students, so I hope you have a good spring recess, we'll say. Yeah, anyway, see ya.